Hello, my name is Darren Thomas and I am the Director of Educational Research Techniques. In this video, we're going to take a quick look at some examples and ways of teaching pronunciation, primarily for ESL students. So let's go ahead and see what we can learn. So we're going to look at 4 different ways that you can support your ESL students. ESL means English as a second language students. To develop skills in pronunciation. And of course, these ideals and these approaches to teaching pronunciation can be applied towards teaching any language. They're not limited to just the context of teaching English. But you can see on the screen that there are 4 different ways that we're going to cover in this particular video. The first one is whole lesson. Second is discrete slots. Next is integrated phases. And last is opportunistic teaching. So let's take a look at the first one. Whole class is basically where you have an entire lesson dedicated to teaching pronunciation. And so you can focus on such skills as intonation, which is sometimes very, very important. Like when people are asking a question in English, they kind of like to rise the tone like, what did he say? I'm exaggerating, but you get the idea. And so intonation matters, but of course in other languages, intonation is much more important. You can also look at key phrases, like greetings, phrases related to going to a restaurant or asking where the bathroom is, as an example. These are examples of key phrases. And so you can build your whole class lesson on these different intonation skills or key phrases, or any other skill that people may need to pronounce words clearly in a language. There are, of course, always going to be pros and cons. So I guess one of the pros is that if everybody is struggling with the same problem, with whole class, you can fix that problem with one simple solution. There are often many milestones or challenges that students have in common, and that is where maybe going with the whole class is most appropriate. And of course, there can also be challenges with this. Again, the opposite of everybody having the same problem is people having different problems, which is very difficult to support whole class teaching of pronunciation if people have unique, distinct problems. This can be particularly challenging if your ESL students are from different non-English speaking countries, as an example. So you have kids from Asia, you have kids from Europe, you have kids from Africa, you have kids from South America. They all are going to have slightly different pronunciation problems, as an example, because they're coming from different languages. So it'll be much harder to support them using whole class in some situations. So you really have to keep these challenges in mind, in that whole class is great when people have similar problems, but can be much more difficult when people have different problems. Let's move on. The next example here, the next way of teaching pronunciation is called discrete slots. And these are like short mini lessons within a larger lesson. So you might focus on like vowel sounds or any other skill related to pronunciation. So you have your larger lesson, and then within that lesson, you have little short lessons that might deal with pronunciation. And so it allows you to integrate it into your lesson without it being the focus of the whole thing. That's kind of what's happening here. And so one of the benefits, perhaps, when you're looking at this particular style of teaching pronunciation is with the shorter lessons, you have a higher attention. This can be very valuable for younger students who lack the mental fortitude, if you will, to be able to focus on something long and boring like how to pronounce different words. Where when you just sneak it in for a few minutes, you're able to keep the kids engaged. Now, on the flip side of that, because the lessons are shorter, you may have less time dedicated to pronunciation, so they may not progress as much. Again, it really depends on the content of the classroom, the characteristics of the students, and the style of the teacher to determine, what is appropriate in terms of how to deal with the challenges of pronunciation. Example number 3 here is integrated phases. So you focus on pronunciation as an example when teaching other skills. So for example, you are teaching reading. The goal of reading is to read. However, you can also incorporate proper pronunciation into that, especially when you have students read aloud, which is a very common strategy for improving pronunciation. Also for listening, helping students to be aware of different types of accents and how people pronounce things. versus, the English accent versus the British accent or the Australian accent of English, etc. These are, again, different ways that you can integrate these things. And of course, some of the skills on this can vary. So I've already given you some examples of that, but naturally there are also pros and cons here. So of course the pros is that, it's very realistic. This is similar to the real world. There are times in the real world where people read out loud. It's not that common anymore, but it does happen. There are times in the world where you have to be sensitive to different accents and how people talk and being able to adjust and pick up what they mean. But of course, now what makes this challenging is also what makes it a blessing, and that is the integration. So what can happen is that the student becomes overwhelmed cognitively. So a kid is really trying to read and you're harassing them about proper pronunciation. It can be overwhelming and even discouraging for some students because they're having to really focus on these two different things. So integrating might be more appropriate for students who are closer to mastery in one of the two skills you want to integrate. So for example, if the kids are already really good at reading, adding a layer of complexity where you start to focus on pronunciation may be appropriate. Whereas if the kids are beginners when it comes to reading, maybe being concerned with pronunciation is not appropriate yet. But again, what you do and how you do it really depends on the context of your individual classroom. And then lastly, we have opportunistic teaching. And this is where you deal with pronunciation whenever it is needed, and you don't have a specific game plan in advance. So the skills that you are going to be focusing on depend on the situation. And of course, there are pros and cons with this as well. You are, of course, being very sensitive to the needs of the learners. So you're focusing on pronunciation when you can clearly see that this is a problem at that particular moment. However, the downside of overly focusing on the needs of the students is a higher sense of chaos for the teacher. If pronunciation is only dealt with on a context by context basis, well, it's going to be very hard to focus on, trying to find a way to, mark and put grades for that into the system. It's going to be very hard to provide consistent, steady feedback and to mark progress because you're kind of like a firefighter putting out fires. And so it's hard to gauge progress and keep track of how things are doing in that particular situation. But again, we're not going to sit here and say that this is an inappropriate way of teaching pronunciation. We're just pointing out how there are strengths and weaknesses in each style of doing this. And of course, we all know that perhaps the best way is to have a combination of these different skills, these different styles of teaching when trying to deal with pronunciation. A little bit of opportunistic, integrated, discrete, whole class. If these things work together, you're able to support students from a variety of backgrounds in a variety of situations. And so that's why it's important to be aware of all of these different choices so that you're ready to be able to help your students as necessary. So to summarize what we have learned in this lesson, we have looked at different ways to support students as they are focusing on improving their pronunciation. And you can see on the screen here that there are 4 different ways that we covered: whole lesson, discrete slots, integrated phases, and opportunistic teaching. When to use each of these really depends on the learning style of your students, your teaching style, and the context that you are all in when you are in the classroom. So I want to thank you so much for listening. My name is Darren Thomas. I am the Director of Educational Research Techniques. Thank you again for watching, and you take care.